Call the meeting of the Parish Township Planning Commission, August 15, 2022 to order. Thank you all for being here. Do I have any discussion before we look to approve the minutes from our June meeting?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Discussion, questions, comments? All those in favor of approving those minutes?
Aye.
Thank you. Opposed? Public comment. Any of you here for items that are not on the agenda? If so, we want to hear from you now. If they're part of the agenda, we'll get to them when we get to that part of the agenda. Okay. We have a couple of things on the agenda tonight. Village parking, official map, planning for next month, and other smaller items. Anything else before we go to approve those agenda items? Great. Bob?
I'll second.
Motion. Jeff? Excuse me. Kent, thank you. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you. Business. You gonna walk us through official map? Excuse me, parking committee recommendations?
Yeah, I'm going to walk you through. We put together a PowerPoint and it might be a little bit easier to go through it that way. And then we do have members of the parking committee here this evening who can answer questions that you may have. Okay. You want to go to the first slide?
Nope.
Okay. So the village parking committee was created in September of 21. It was created in September of 2021. The committee was charged with reviewing the current off-street parking regulations and studying parking issues within the village of Bollesburg. The parking committee met over about 6 months, and they did a bunch of work. And when I say a bunch of work, they did a lot of work. They looked at our current regulations. They looked at the recommendations that were in the small area plan, as well as the parking issue. And the village of Bollesburg itself has been studied since, I'm convinced, the 1970s or early 80s up until the early 2000s, if not later. So they looked at that. They also, for the first time, in all of these reports from way back, going back into the 80s, they talked about, oh, let's share parking with the fire company and the churches, but nobody ever asked the fire company or the churches if that was something they wanted to do. So they had that conversation. And they also looked at communities from across the state and what they were doing. So this is just a list of the communities that they looked at. Mark did a whole comprehensive report for them, which then they reviewed. And there was a lot of good stuff that we found within these communities, which made it into the recommendations within the parking report. So we're gonna go through, someone's not muted. We're gonna go through the parking recommendations from the report with the goal tonight that we would like you to talk about changing, this is the first one, changing the off-street parking regulations to allow for use of shared off-site parking. Currently in the village, you're allowed to share parking between adjacent parcels that are within 66 feet of each other. We believe the 66 feet regulation happened when the Heritage Museum went in on Loop Road because the Bollesburg Steakhouse was 66 feet away and they could share parking with the Bollesburg Steakhouse. It's not the most user-friendly thing because 66 feet isn't really very far. So we have the chart up there that shows you where it's allowed in other locations, and it's typically 500 feet or less, slightly less. So that's one of the things we'd like to have a greater discussion on this evening. No, you can go ahead. So just some things to think about. Again, the appropriate distance, and Mark can talk a little bit more about that. And I think we'll circle back after we go through the recommendations. He can talk a little bit more about that. If agreements would be required between property owners, how will the sharing work between the property owners? Will it be regulated in some way, and will it be based on hours of operation? Just a couple of things to consider on that item. Okay. And then recommendation 1B, which goes along with the off-street parking, off-site shared parking, would be to allow it between parking on properties that are in remote locations, so like the Bollesburg Fire Hall or other churches. This is a little more complex because the Fire Hall and St. John's Church were at our meeting back in the winter, and they both said they were amenable to discussing this further, but they had questions related to lighting, pedestrian access, ADA, concerns, and then also making sure that if they're gonna allow it, it has to, like, the fire company rents out their fire hall. And they do pretty robust business running out the Bull Hall. So they wanna make sure that that's not gonna impact what parking is needed for that. So this is the longer term piece of this recommendation. So 1A is just the feet, which we wanna discuss tonight because we think that's a fairly low hanging fruit. 1B is sort of the longer term discussion of that. So before we go to recommendation number 2, does anybody have any questions about this first recommendation? Jeff?
Liability and shared parking.
That's one of the things that needs to be discussed as part of this, yes. Anyone else? Okay. So recommendation number 2, and this plays into the official map conversation that we're gonna have later this evening, was the development of public parking lots. So the committee actually sat with our mapping and they looked and identified locations that could be added to the official map. Blue Spring Park, which is on Wagner Street, was discussed. The post office property, which is not owned by the United States Postal Service, it's actually owned by somebody that lives in State College. And I'm not sure what's gonna happen with the United States Postal Service, but I would think this is one we would wanna jump on if the Postal Service is not long for this world. 123 North Church Street, 234 East Main Street, and 229 rear East Main Street. So these are all, these would be public parking lots, surface lots, not necessarily for people, like we're gonna develop the lot behind us, behind the building here. That's for visitors, right? That's not necessarily for people to use if they don't have off-street parking at their rental property or if they're, using it for their business. It's kind of more for visitors that come to the village. So we'll be adding these locations on to the official map, and again, we'll talk more about that tonight. Does anyone have any questions about this? Jeff?
Where are you gonna get money to buy these properties?
Well, that's a conversation for the Board of Supervisors. We do have a special projects tax that we put on, and that we identify special projects within the budget every year to spend that money on. So that's something they can certainly look at. Okay, next one. And these are just some things to consider. Lighting, pedestrian access, again, we've talked about needing wayfinding signage. I worked in the borough of Elizabethtown in Lancaster County. M&M Mars is located in Elizabethtown. They actually paid to have every one of their municipal surface lots has an M&M, like a green M&M, the red M&M, whatever, and then you identify that you're parking in whatever that lot is. So I'm not saying we have M&Ms in Bollesburg, but something like that we could, tap into so people knew where they were going. Okay. Recommendation number 3, and this one I think is the most probably intriguing because we found this in Lidditz. Was it Lidditz? Yeah, Lidditz Borough. So this would be allowing on-street parking spaces to count toward off-street parking requirements. So the thought process is we have a village that is 200 plus years old and that has interesting lot constraints. And some of those lots, they can provide some, but not all of the off-street parking they would need for a business that they wanted to locate there. So if that business has frontage, we would allow them to assign a number of spaces, 1 or 2 spaces onto that off-street parking requirement. It certainly shouldn't be something that it's like you have to provide 12 spaces so you can have 12 on-street spaces, but it should be used to supplement, provide some relief. That's how Lidditz does it as well. Some things to consider here, and this is probably the biggest one, we don't have lined parking spaces now. The only time those spaces get lined is when they line them for the booths on Memorial Day and then everybody gets confused and tries to park in them. So that's a conversation piece. And then also, I guess we need to find an equitable way to determine the amount of on-street spaces that are allowed for each property. Because some properties, like looking at Rebecca because she's sitting here, but across the street has a lot of frontage, and some properties down towards the core of the village don't have a lot of frontage. And then the committee also felt that given the narrow width of North Church Street, they questioned if the on-street parking on the east side of that street should be eliminated, because that street does get kind of blocked up when you try to travel through there. So do you have any questions about recommendation number 3?
To the last point, have we had any complaints from the fire marshal, fire chief?
Occasionally, yes. Yeah. Okay. So this one, I think, is probably, I was telling the parking committee, when the small area plan did their report, the road diet was like their marquee recommendation. This is the parking committee's recommendation. We have 4 properties around the diamond that have absolutely no ability to provide off-street parking. They just do not have any space for off-street parking. And they rely entirely upon the on-street parking. And what our solicitor has said is they ever want to change uses, they have to stay the use they're at now. So the solicitor said they can't change their use. That devalues a property technically. That causes them to have issues. We also have existing non-residential properties that don't have the ability to provide additional off-street property because they have small lots and we have oddly shaped lots in the village. So what this does, and this was another one that we found in, was this also Lidditz?
Lidditz has several, overlay districts.
Yeah, so this was the idea that we would create an overlay district in the village that would address these concerns. It would look at impervious coverage, it would look at the uses that are allowed, it would look at how they provide parking if they don't have off-street parking available to them. This one will take the longest in terms of drafting because it takes a lot of thought and you have to craft out the area. If you want to go to the next slide with it. You have to kind of craft out the area where the overlay zone would be and then the regulations within that. But we also feel that it's probably maybe the most important recommendation within this report because it addresses a significant concern within the village. The next one. Yes.
What was the, can we flip that a second? So to address these conditions, the committee is recommending that the township consider creating an overlay district that will create separate zoning regulations for a subset of properties in the village.
Yep.
What exactly does that mean? Where does that head?
So that would be taking, we would have to study the village and we would have to find properties that have like characteristics and they're unique characteristics. No off-street parking, the ability to not meet our current impervious regulations. Like their lot coverage, there were a lot of things that we talked about in the committee and that's part of this, right, is to study that. We talked about it would be basically somewhere around the diamond, which is the core of the village. That's the historic sort of center of the village, the commercial area of the village, and then finding all the properties that would meet that
So
criteria.
it would be like create zoning within the village district, but it's not like the standard criteria for zoning. So it's not like residential zoning
Right,
or something
it would
like
be,
that.
it would be like your corridor overlay district, same type of thing.
Okay.
It would just be for the village.
So I guess the intent of that would be to have more relaxed requirements for those properties because obviously they can't meet the regular
Consistency.
parking requirements that the township has now.
Yes,
So it'd be creating a separate set of regulations, like either a reduced amount of parking or no parking or maybe the parking, the construction of the parking would be different. Maybe it wouldn't have to be paved, lit, things like that. Did any of the other municipalities you looked at, is that what they did? Was they create situations where they just reduced the requirements?
Not necessarily for parking per se, but there's a lot of places that had not necessarily an overlay district, but there were a lot of places where their downtown areas were broken up into multiple districts. And I think a lot of it was to try to right zone for what's there now. So it's not so much about applying one standard that fits for everybody, but trying to make it work where, certain clusters of properties are similar. It might have been a reduction in parking. It could have been a reduction in an increase in your impervious coverage limitations. It just depended upon the circumstances of the properties they were trying to address within those districts or those overlays. So I think back to Amy's point, that's where the study part of this comes in. What are the unique characteristics that exist in the village on some properties where they're primarily non-residential? What types of characteristics do they have that are in common? There may be some things they just don't have in common and aren't worth addressing, but it would be a matter of kind of researching that out and seeing what needs to be addressed in an overlay. Right.
Well, I'll just comment, I could see some logic behind that. However, to be fair, with the other property, because you're gonna reduce requirements for those properties. So to be fair to the properties right across the street from them or right down the street from them, who are having to comply with our current regulations, I could see that maybe the properties that are in these special districts may pay a fee in lieu of parking on an annual basis to accommodate that.
we haven't talked about a fee in lieu of.
I didn't think you had.
That's not something we've discussed here.
Right.
Isn't that spot zoning?
It is not spot zoning if we study and group together properties that have unique
As long as we
characteristics.
fairly address it and make sure we're not forcing properties into or not including properties that should be included. I think that's part of it, is making sure we're just fair to everyone.
We've always tried to stay away from that because of the legitimize of somebody else saying, well, you allowed it to happen here, why can't it happen over here when a lawyer comes in front of you?
Well, and that's the whole idea of doing a study first, and that's why you do the study first, because you guard against spot zoning when you present the study that says, we studied the entire village of Bollesburg and we found that these properties within this area have the same unique characteristics, so it speaks to allowing them to have different zoning from the rest of the village. And we have a very special village. Our village is 200 plus years old, and in the wings of the village, for lack of a better word, but out West Main, out East Main here, maybe not East Main, but out West Main, it's more modern. There are bigger lots. There are houses that are not, they're conforming. It's not issues. But in that commercial core, if you want to call it, the village center, that's where we sort of have the biggest problems, because that's the oldest, this is the oldest part of the village, but that's the oldest part of the village with businesses and things. So that's kind of what we're trying to address with this. And this, I think, one of the overreaching goals from the Parks and Rec, or from the Parking Committee when they were looking at this was, right now our ordinance provides no relief, right? So it's either you can provide parking or you can't provide parking. And so the goal was to find ways to provide some relief. When we were looking at, before we started this work, I looked at College Township's regulations with Kent, which Kent, I'm sure you're familiar with, but College Township provides some relief. Allowing off-site shared parking is some relief. This is another way to provide relief on a bigger scale to more properties. Does anyone else have any more questions about this one? I would say that one of the things, I want to bring this point out because I think it's a good one, that was discussed when we talk about this overlay, is that this shouldn't just be a static thing that stays the same areas, that there should be a process to look at those geographical boundaries every so many years, so that way we're making sure that we're not harming somebody who's just outside the overlay zone itself.
And my understanding is tonight we want to focus on recommendation number 1 and then prioritize the other ones for later work sessions.
Yes, we're not quite done yet.
Okay.
We have another recommendation, yes.
Nothing on that screen.
No,
Yeah.
good. Oh, yeah, this is more about the overlay.
Yeah, so.
Okay, so recommendation number 5, and this is probably more a conversation for the Board of Supervisors, but one that I think you guys should weigh in on as well, is to look at the mix of our residential and our non-residential uses. The documents written about the village over the years always reference that the village was a harmonious mix of residential and non-residential uses. I'm not sure what harmonious mix actually means. It's not defined anywhere in the language.
Ear of the beholder.
Yeah, so when we look at the properties that are residential, the properties that are non-residential, and then we're looking at it with a parking space bent, right? And if we have parking available, the deficiencies, that kind of thing. So that's a conversation piece that will also need to be had by the Board of Supervisors and also the Planning Commission as we move on. And this is just a little more about that. And I think one of the things that ties into this is just the intensive nature of a use. When I first started working here in the township 17 years ago today, at a planning commission meeting ideally, Chris Lee, the first thing Chris Lee ever told me was, I saved the village from laundromats and drive-thrus. And I was like, okay, laundromats and drive-thrus, got it. And in 2022, I think laundromats aren't a concern anymore. So just something to think about. Think about the uses and what uses we want and don't want. Okay, so any overall questions on the report itself? Not seeing any. Okay. So then what Chris said is right. We want to talk about the distance for the shared parking, and Mark brought some information, correct, on that? You didn't bring the map?
I can go see if I have it over there.
Okay, Mark's gonna go see if he has his map. Talk about that, and then the Board of Supervisors also asked that you prioritize what items you wanted to start working on now, and then what items will go on your work plan. And the nice thing is we'll have the joint meeting in January with the board, so you'll have an opportunity to discuss some of what you've been working on with them as well.
So number one's low-hanging fruit, right?
Yes.
Are there any others that we would consider, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Are there any others that we would consider low-hanging fruit?
I would say that the public parking lots is also low-hanging fruit, because that,
Parking on the street, using the street parking frontage as available parking to the.
well, I would, respectfully, I would say that the parking lots first is low-hanging fruit, because that goes to the official map. And then second would be the other one, looking at the on-street spaces. Yes. The overlay district is one that's gonna take the longest, because that's gonna take a lot of study to make sure we're not.
I think that's the one that's most important, because that's the one that could be the key,
Yes.
or a key.
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking if we could get some get some things done, because we might never get to the overlay district, right? Pardon me?
So I guess I'll
There's
raise
a
a
whole nother group up here by the time that gets done, right?
I'll raise a question on the first one. I don't know if Mark's gonna talk about it or not, but as far as
Shared parking. Because normally if you have shared parking, then you have an agreement with an adjacent or a nearby property owner or within X number of feet. So, and I guess the idea behind that is that other property would have those spaces available, meaning they weren't required parking for that particular property, or you'd be double counting it. So is that something you've talked about, or, because I know that's normally, or if you're gonna double count it,
Go to the microphone, Bob.
Yes, sir, ma'am.
Thank you.
Hoffman. I think, Kent, one of the things that we didn't talk about, which might be on that list, is what happens if a property is sold. In other words, you have an agreement, and the property's sold. Let's say the fire company hopefully never leave, but left, and then you would have to have a new kind of an agreement set up to use that. So that should be some of the punch list items for that topic, I think. It might be a residence that, I think it'd be easier to say a residence that the township buys, well then it's theirs. But if it's not a residence that the township owns, you have to have agreement of transfer. So,
that's, my point is normally you would have an agreement, and the agreement would be filed, you know, at the courthouse, so it would carry with the property if the property's sold, unless they change the agreement.
well, that's true.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's very possible, but like most things, it's how you work out the details of that. And also, you know, would those, in the case of, you know, we've talked a lot about the fire hall and you know, and some of the supplemental parking with the church lots. You know, those are gravel spaces, or a lot of them are gravel spaces, so, which don't comply with the zoning regulations, and they're not lit, which doesn't comply with the zoning regulations. So are we gonna relax those requirements, or is that gonna be something that would be a condition that those would have to be upgraded?
So so as I said, there's sort of two parts to recommendation one. 1A is changing the 66 feet distance. That's what we want to talk about tonight. Because we have some provisions within the zoning ordinance now about how you can share the parking between adjacent properties if they're so many feet apart. The second part, which is good that you brought up with the using the fire hall and the churches or whatever, that's like 1B, and that's a bigger piece of this that we need to flesh out more, because there are bigger questions. The ADA parking spaces is a bigger one that we need to worry about. So we'd like to just focus on, and Mark put up a map here that shows some walking mapped out how far things are. So we'd like to focus on that number, taking that 66 feet number and changing that to a more usable number.
And the concentric rings here on the map, that's 100-foot intervals, so you can get an idea from the Diamond or any property in the village just how far it is to walk based on those rings from one property to another. We just showed the distance from around the Township building and from the Diamond down to both the fire company lot and the St. John's Church lot, just to give you an idea of how far it would be to walk with current sidewalks to get there from those two locations. And obviously if you wanted to go further west on Main, you can just add based on the concentric circles to see how far it would be to go to any of those locations.
I would think that at least 500 feet. At least 500 would seem reasonable, maybe 6. I mean, 500 here, out here, 600 up here.
Is there a sense from any of the committee members who are here tonight, what expanding the distance is advisable? You guys have been thinking about this more than we have.
Well, we have. Notice we didn't give you a solution. That's, by the way, we wanted to, but we wanted to hold back and let the solutions come. I would say, just looking at that, the 600 would not bother me. I think people traditionally want to park right in front of something, so they'll do their options and eventually get to where they can park. But I think it opens up the church a little bit, and definitely the fire company in that area. And as Bob said, you can read the symmetrical. I think that's reasonable. I don't know that, obviously if you provide enough ADA accessible parking close to the diamond would be my recommendation because of the physical situation. But I mean, I think that some of those parking lots should have maybe at the fire company a little better accessible parking up front. But I think that's a reasonable map. I think it goes and reaches our goal of potential outreach in the community. So, yes, that's what I was thinking. I think that's a good map. It shows future potential too.
Mark, you did that.
I'm sorry?
You did that? You put that map together?
Yeah, well, I didn't. I directed someone in the office to put it together.
It's a great map.
It's a good thing. That was my point. It was a great map, regardless of it.
Mr. Arnold because he does a wonderful job with all the maps here. So. The park? Well, you can see it's at least 700-800 feet or more easily. I think I actually looked at it at one point. It was.
The edge of it's what, 600?
It's pretty far.
Yeah. Yeah.
Blue Springs
Oh,
Park.
that's kind of south.
No, that's Alley,
So it's probably about 700.
No, it's more than that.
It's 700 just to right past tennis, so you're
It's
probably
probably like
looking
1,000
or more.
That's pretty far.
Yeah.
That's only a 5-minute walk, really.
Preserve, how far is that parking lot?
Yeah, for you.
Preserve? Yoder?
Yoder Preserve is
It's even
further
further.
down,
Yeah.
so it's
Well,
probably,
there's still all public parking that we do have.
yeah.
That's accessible.
Yeah, I mean, Yoder Preserve is
Right,
probably
and
a lot.
I mean, I don't think we need an agreement. That gets into the, I guess that's point 2 about the public parking lots. And I don't think we need an agreement for that, because if the township, either the property owners are providing parking or the township's providing parking, and actually both occur. But if you, the township's providing public parking really for anybody. And also the township can decide to change at any time. They may, for site distance problems or just general issues, parking problems or something like that, they may restrict some parking areas. They may, they may do any kind of thing with it. That's why I don't think we need to have an agreement for those particular ones that are on public property, like the park, or the, this building, this space here, or in our rights of ways. And so I think those are just, to me, those are like overflow spaces that are always available.
Visitor parking.
And
Can I bring up one issue?
Can you go to the
Yeah, I
microphone?
know.
If you go to the microphone, you can bring up any issue you have.
Okay, it's just, the issue has to do with, if there's going to be hours, in which people. are
Diane,
allowed-
behind the microphone helps Sina a lot. Thank you.
Diane Farr. I thought that the issue needed to be brought up about, if, we're making it sound like this is going to be open all the time, but that's not necessarily true. It may have hours where it's acceptable to park and hours where it's essentially, I'll say, closed. I think that's another consideration you need to take in mind, especially since, for example, we have a bed and breakfast that is just right down the corner. Now, they have 5 parking places, I believe, in the back. And if they were to have people park here, that would be very reasonable. But if you're having hours, which is acceptable or not acceptable, that's just another consideration.
Are you speaking specifically for hours in the township-owned
I'm just,
lots?
at this moment, I'm just using that as an example. You're the ones who will make the decision about the other parking lots. But I think it's a consideration you need to
Mhm.
bring into the discussion.
Mhm.
Okay?
About that. I think what she's saying, I think I would agree with her in that I don't think that we should be providing overnight parking on a township parking lot. I don't think we should say, oh, you know, Johnny Sue or whatever, you can come park in here and stay a week while you're staying at your neighbor's across the way, and when the neighbor has parking in the back or whatever. I think that this is meant for people coming and visiting and enjoying or whatever, but it's not meant for overnight parking.
Yeah, so that's,
Yeah, but in case of a private lot, if you have parking spaces on your lot.
And you can essentially control that, if you're seeing a problem. And for the township ones, we generally don't control it unless there is a problem, a reported problem or people complain. And then we can put signs up that say no overnight parking. We can do all kinds of things. And that's why, I'm personally think we need to totally separate our public parking, the on-street parking and the lots on our public lands from the private spaces.
yeah.
I'm not personally in favor of counting our public spaces towards the adjacent properties, because, there's no guarantee in the long term that we're going to keep those spaces. We may have to regulate them somehow in the future.
Jeff?
I don't see how that answers the problem, because if you have a time limit on the public places, this park and the other 2 parks, and you don't allow people to park there past 10 o'clock, then they're just gonna park on the street, and then that's gonna take parking spaces away from you guys.
Yeah, we-
Say 10 o'clock.
we're talking-
Until 1 in the morning.
Yeah, we're talking
Just
more.
talking not overnight.
Right, and we're talking more like here with the, and again, this is away from what we're discussing, which is the shared parking right now. We're kind of confusing the two. But the idea with the public parking lot, right, the one that we're putting in back here, during our business hours, we'd really like that to be available for folks to come to the township building and be able to park. And we'd also really like it when we have meetings, because right now when we have meetings, Kenny, who used to live next door, used to direct people to park in his driveway and I think try to charge them. So I'd like to have a place for them to park too. So perhaps Monday nights you can't park in our parking lot, you know what I mean? So it's that kind of reasonable hour. It's not saying at 10 o'clock, I'm not coming out in my meter maid outfit to tell you to get out.
Yeah, you're not gonna have any enforcement, right? You're just gonna have a sign.
We could have enforcement through State College Police.
I
But
mean, could I add something? One thing that came to our mind was when we have snow events, because there are properties that really have trouble, especially downtown. And so maybe the township put out a note saying, during the snow event, you can park in the lot, but please remove it. That way it alleviates some of the pressure downtown.
My understanding is that tonight we're getting the overview of all of the issues and the series of recommendations, but we're being asked specifically to address the 66 feet.
Yep.
So while I think this is a great conversation, I think this is the beginning of this committee's conversation. And so I'd like to circle back to, do we have a number that we should pick to recommend to the supervisors? Or are we just saying, let's move away from the 66 feet?
I would suggest you pick a number.
Yeah, I think we can get
You
there.
want a motion?
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that,
Thank you.
circle back, Amy.
Do you want a motion?
Yes.
I move that we make the distance 600 feet.
Second.
Now, nothing.
I think it should be larger.
Morris calling.
I think it should be 1,000.
Can we go back
to the map.
Am I correct that 600 does not include the church?
It
I was counting the,
I think it does. It
Barely
didn't
does.
include the park.
So, and just remember that the off-site shared parking with the church or the fire hall is a separate conversation
Right.
from this. This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
if Tracy wanted to allow somebody within 600 feet of her property to share her parking on the days or times she's not open and she hasn't agreed with them. I'm using Tracy as an example.
So the zero starts at the point of arrival for the guest, and the measurement is where they would where we direct them
To the
park.
property to property.
Property to property.
Okay, so
think
it's
it's-
not measured from the diamond.
It's the near edge, the
Right.
nearest edges of property that we're talking about.
And to be clear, the current ordinance allows you to have your required parking located off-site within 66 feet, as long as you are in the village zoning district or in the village commercial district, which is out along Bull Avenue. So the residential properties here behind the village wouldn't be able to host parking for a use in the village under the current regulations. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the ordinance does not currently allow you to share the space. It is simply locating it there. So if there's going to be any component of this, business uses it from 8 to 5 and this one uses it from 6 to 9, that's not currently in the ordinance. The current distance is just to have the parking off-site.
And I believe Todd had his hand up. I was alerted to that. Todd, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, the only reason I had my hand up, and I think Amy Moore addressed what I was going to say. All the conversations earlier in the conversation were about the distance from the diamond, and if you were to propose a 600-foot distance or a 700-foot distance to locate parking spaces on another property from a subject property, if someone down near the township office was to propose to use parking spaces on another property, the ones at the fire hall and the churches probably wouldn't be available because they wouldn't be within 600 feet of the township building because we wouldn't be measuring from the center of the diamond. So you're probably going to want to take that into consideration in the deliberations.
I think for the intent of sharing spaces though, 600 feet, that's not that long a walk, but it's far enough to give property owners flexibility in sourcing shared parking.
So why wouldn't we entertain a farther distance?
Because Kelly's is out of the circle, and that's one of the biggest parking lots.
But
That's
they're
why
not-
I'm saying it should be farther.
It's out of the circle for the far side of the map, but anybody on this side,
Anybody on this
Park
side
there,
could
share
I
at
just
the
didn't make
Harris
the map
Township.
that big.
Okay, because
Yeah,
that's
I
what
mean,
I was
anybody on
looking
this
at,
side
is
of
it going
the-
from, I'm looking at Duffy's to not even Kelly's is 900 feet, and they can't even get to Kelly's.
Yeah, but anybody on this side, like, again, I'm gonna pick on Rebecca, she lives across the street, but Rebecca could share with Kelly's, cause she's more than likely within 600 feet of Kelly's right now.
Well, yeah.
I mean, again, this is intended that it's, if I have a property on the east side of the diamond and I wanna share with somebody I look for somebody that's within 600 feet that I can share with, it's private property.
Tracy, what do you think?
Well, I think
You could go out to.
I like to walk, but then again, I look at the 600 feet, I'm looking at the walking distance. 600 feet is not even 3 minutes of walking. My idea is to be flexible with it and to help people and use imagination with this. And I think providing relief at 1,000 feet, I think that allows you actually to go as far as the park, which I think is a beautiful walk. I think is reasonable. If you think about a lot of these things that might happen coming along the way, we might get busy or something might happen, and that allows people to make sure that they're following the regulations as well. And I don't see anything wrong with that at all.
Mark, do you know why Valfont and some of the other communities were in that 500 to 600 foot range? That's always why I kind of drew my attention to that. Do we have any rationale for that?
I was at Bellefonte, I've been walking around Bellefonte. Bellefonte has a lot of different public little areas, like, well, parking. They have actually designated parking if you drive around. All their businesses and everything, they can meet those requirements to those parking lots.
There's nothing, I mean, there's nothing in their ordinances, and a lot of these ordinances have been established decades ago. As to why they picked that distance, it very well may be that just, that typically satisfies everyone's need, because there's typically something within 500 feet.
So that wasn't necessarily a recommendation that was up there, it was more just an example.
Yeah.
I recommend it be 1,000 feet.
Well, we have a motion on here for 600, so unless we're gonna amend that motion, let's vote on this one. Those in favor of unless there's more discussion.
Why don't we just amend the motion to 1,000 feet?
Bob, you wanna amend your motion?
I'll amend the motion to 1,000 feet.
Second it.
Okay.
Amy has to do it.
Conversation on that?
So Amy
Yeah,
has a second.
I'm seconding
Yeah.
Okay.
the amended motion.
Don't know, it's close
You did
enough.
second it then?
I did second.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't think, I mean, I just want, this is, the way it's written now is it's sharing spaces with another private property owner, not sharing spaces with the township
Correct.
owned property, which to me is a whole separate thing. And I see that falling under, item 2. That we're gonna provide public parking as overflow, and we do now, and we'll continue to do that. And so I don't necessarily think that we should assign, say, spaces either over here or in Blue Spring Park for a specific business in town.
Right.
We're gonna assign, it's just gonna be general parking, so. That's why I don't think the 1,000 is necessary, but I'll vote in favor of it, because I'm in favor of the change in general.
Todd's got his hand up again. Todd?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm thinking this is a more important point than what you folks will, but I think it's important to point out that the way these things are thought about shared parking now is if a property is going to share parking with another property, they can only share the extra parking that they have on their property. They can't share the required parking that's on their property. So if they have, if a property that's going to agree to share property with another property owner is required to have 4 spaces on their property, they're not going to be able to share any of those 4 spaces, because why would we allow a property owner to exhaust some of their required parking and create, a situation where they don't have enough required parking on their own property in order to provide parking spaces for another property. So what you may see is there may not be as many properties available to share parking as you see on a map there. There are some wider properties and there are some bigger properties in the village zoning district. That doesn't mean all of them are going to be able to provide parking to share, even if they're willing to do so. So a smaller number, to me, seems like it's going to be more restrictive than it might actually seem.
That's a good point.
Would that depend on hours of operation?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's something that we discussed earlier in the conversation about, that's a different subject. When you're talking about sharing parking on a property based on hours of operation, I don't think that's what we're talking about with this particular item. We'd have to talk more in depth on that later.
We did talk a little bit at the committee meeting, Todd, and I think you were there, about, for example, we have a dog grooming on the business on the Diamond that's a drop-off business, right? And their hours are different than, I'm picking on Duffy's, I don't mean to, but their hours are different than Duffy's, which operates in the evening. So, and they don't have any parking. So maybe if they said we'd like to share with Duffy's because our hours are completely opposite of Duffy's, so they're not taking away any of that parking. That was a conversation piece, but I think right now we're just focused on opening up the possibility. But what Todd brings up is actually a good thought, which is we can't take away then the required spacing, because then you're just going to cause more parking problems, and that's not the intent of this.
Well, all we're talking about right now is the distance proximity for shared parking. We're not talking about hours of operation or how that may relate, that these businesses that operate 4 to midnight or whatever, that's a separate issue in my mind. And, if we're just talking about distance right now, I'm fine with 1,000 1,000 linear feet.
Any other questions or comments, conversation on this point? Okay, the motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor? Signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay.
So you're gonna take that to the supervisors?
Take that to the supervisors at their meeting in September and discuss that and look at what's in the ordinance now, which Todd and Mark know better than I do about shared parking and what we want to add in if we want to add something in. The other thing they asked you to do, and I'd like to be able to take this back to the supervisors as well to let them know we have this conversation. They asked you guys to come up with things you'd like to work on now, things that go on the 23 work plan. I think the overlay district goes on your 23 work
Yes.
plan, because I think that joint meeting is a good starting point for that discussion with the supervisors.
I think public parking lots is something we could do this fall.
Yes.
And maybe 3 as well. Is that too ambitious? The
Oh,
on-street
yeah.
counting
I
for
think
off?
I think they all go together, if we're gonna talk about them.
So hold off on the overlay and the more sort of,
No, I'm saying 2, 3, and 4, I think.
Yeah,
all-
yes.
All go together.
Well, I think you could start working on 2 and 3, the public parking lots and then the on-street parking spaces counting towards off-street parking requirements this fall. And then when you meet with the supervisors in January, which is the 4th Wednesday of January, you can talk a little bit about what you've done and how that might dovetail into some of the overlay discussion as well.
Staff said number 4 is a lot of work, huh?
It is a lot of work. Mark's up for the challenge.
Hopefully we have people.
it seemed like people on Zoom, commission members on Zoom, did you follow that? Sort of pointing to 2 and 3 in the next 3-4 months, 4 and 5 rolling into the 23 work plan.
I think it sounds great.
Sure.
Is that enough, Amy? Who's here from the parking committee?
Yep. Frank was on the.
Thank you very much for your service on this. It's a lot of time and a lot of
Yes.
assessment, and I know we're just beginning.
Amy, that was a good presentation.
Thank you, everybody. You guys worked so hard on this. Appreciate it.
Good job.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for coming tonight, too.
You can stay. Everybody leave.
Okay, we're moving on to work item B, update on the recent activities of the official map subcommittee. We have a number of the committee members here and staff are working hard, so take us away.
All right, let me just pull up my presentation here real quick. So I put together a PowerPoint tonight that might jump out of it. Actually, I'll probably wait till the end to show you a few things that I think would be valuable for you to see as far as some of the tools that the official map committee used to work on this. Sorry, it's a little slow this evening.
Internet in this room.
Well, that doesn't require internet. I don't know what's taking so long. There we go. So, as a reminder, what is an official map? We've taken the official map that was on the wall there behind you down at this point, so I don't have one to point you. But I will just remind you what it is. This map is permitted by Article 4 of the Municipalities Planning Code. Municipalities can use these to try to show where they'd like to have future public lands and facilities, things like streets and trails, public open space, parks, things of that nature. And what you're doing with this map is you're declaring an interest to the public, a municipal interest in acquiring these lands sometime in the future to do some type of improvement. It helps inform your property owners and developers of the goals that the township has and the intentions before they go about preparing a development plan. These official maps are also helpful in non-development scenarios too, such as when you have potential roadway improvements taking place by state or federal entities or anything of that nature. You can always utilize these maps to say, look what we'd like to do in the future. And what happens though is whenever development's proposed, municipalities do have up to a year to try to acquire land or an easement that they need to develop these things. So while I took away the map behind you on the wall, this is what the old map looked like We had a lot of facilities on here, a lot of proposed roads, proposed parks, shared use paths, but there's been a number that have been developed already over the past 14 years that this map has been in existence. So what happened was the board created an official map subcommittee. They met monthly since March, and what they did is they discussed the types of facilities that should be on this official map. They removed some facilities that were either constructed or were deemed to no longer be feasible. They looked at recommendations that existed in other plans, such as the small area plan. And then they also did a bit of public outreach during June and July. And I'm going to talk tonight primarily about that public outreach and what they found. So the first thing we did is we prepared a story map online. This is what we had done with the rural zoning. People could go on and kind of learn about what was happening. We had a story map we put together that explained what the township's doing, why we're doing it, and provided 2 links to 2 different tools that the public could use to provide input. The first was a survey that we prepared through what's called Survey 123. That is a program we have access to through ArcGIS, which is Geographic Information System software. How's it different than SurveyMonkey? It is different than SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. It has some really cool geographic tools where you can see, it doesn't give a pinpoint exactly where people live, but it allows you to geolocate responses so you have a better idea, except for people who refuse it. We found that if they refused it, they showed up off the west coast of Africa. We had a couple pins off the west coast of Africa that were very confusing at first. And I realized, oh, they opted out of letting their location be known. But anyway, so we did a survey to get information on how the public kind of behaviors related to active transportation, as well as information on where they'd like to travel here in Harris Township. And then we also created a public input app. I don't know if any of you used it. It's a map that you could go on and you could actually physically draw your facility, your dream sidewalk or bike path or what have you. So the survey itself, I'm going to go over some of the responses. We had 155 in total. 93.3% of those were from township residents. We did have non-residents from College, Ferguson, Patton, and Penn townships participate, as well as State College Borough. Vast majority of the responses came from a variety, or I should say, we had responses from the majority of the neighborhoods, but the vast majority came from Bollesburg, The Hill, Kaywood, Liberty Hill, Springfield Commons, and Willowbrook. Those were the highest in terms of participation from a neighborhood point of view. 75% of the respondents were age 45 or older. That might seem a bit off. I will say that the township's demographics, our median age here is, I think, 42 or 43. So we had some responses from younger age brackets, but the most were 45 or older. So as far as those respondents, 100% stated they walk regularly. 90% of those folks walk daily, primarily for health as well as for leisure, and the vast majority walk in Harris Township. Actually, a lot of those folks walk within their neighborhood. Same with bicycling, 80% ride a bike. Most, not as common, a few times a week or a month, mostly for leisure as well as health, and most 67% do so in Harris Township. And actually, again, a lot of those folks ride their bike in their neighborhood. And then 38% occasionally travel via wheeling. For anyone who doesn't know what wheeling is, because this was a fun one for everyone on the committee, it's basically any other type of wheeled transportation that is human powered. So it could be a skateboard, could be rollerblades, could be that person who's doing the cross-country skiing thing over at the military museum. Somebody actually put down a car, which I was a little concerned about how they're using human power to run their vehicle. But aside from that, the Flintstones car, that was all I could think to. Aside from that, it's not as common. 38% said they occasionally travel. I'm not going to go over the wheeling comments because there were so few, but I thought you'd be interested in knowing we did look beyond just these two forms, just bicycling and walking. We did try to get other transportation modes as well. So as far as important facilities that people want to see, they want to see sidewalks, safe and convenient bicycle and pedestrian facilities, crosswalks, shared use paths, street light illumination, on-street bike lanes. These are examples of things that we asked folks, what are safety features that you think are important to you as an active transportation user? You know, if you're out riding a bike or walking, what are the things you want to see more of? And these were the the percentages of what respondents indicated they wanted to have more of or they find valuable. As far as impediments are concerned, speeding traffic, threatening drivers, too much traffic was the highest. Narrow roadways, no road shoulders, lack of sidewalks goes back to where they value sidewalks, but there's majority of folks over 50% feel there's not enough. Lack of bike lanes, bike paths, things of that nature, and just networked routes as well as crosswalks. As far as improvements that the public desired, they indicated shared use paths, other off-road paths to connect bike-friendly streets and trails to each other and to different destinations in the township. Unpaved walking trails to access natural areas, sidewalks where none exist, bike lanes, things of that nature. So it's pretty clear the public would like to see these types of facilities on the map, as it's valuable to them. And I think in terms of sidewalks, if you have a shared use path, you get a 2-for-1 with those. You can ride a bike or active transportation, or you can walk, and that's the benefit of those. So I kind of lump those in with sidewalks to some degree because you're really killing two birds with one stone in that case. So as far as where do people want to go, I think one thing that was clear, and this took a lot of distilling. There's the subcommittee, the official map subcommittee, got to hear me talk about how we had 155 responses and like 130 different ways of people explaining how they go places. We made that an open-ended question, which was a mistake in the end, because I'm sitting there going, all right, I know exactly what walking routes some of these folks do, because they gave me very detailed, this is where I turn, then I go here, then I go here. It was kind of neat, but nonetheless, it's clear that Boalsburg is a central hub where people want to get to. Folks that are out in the eastern part of the township on the other side of 322, they want to get into Boalsburg to be able to access the bike path, to go to places in Boalsburg as well, but also to get to the bike path to go elsewhere. That's the central hub. That's where people want to be. So you have things like the Earlestown Road Corridor going out 45, going out 45 west, Shingletown Road Corridor. Generally, the improvements to Bowl Avenue, there were a lot of comments about we need better pedestrian crossings in certain locations. The area here along the businesses is very, inhospitable to pedestrians and bicyclists. So there was a lot of comments related to those types of improvements, and those were common themes. People want to be able to get to Boalsburg from other neighborhoods and then go outward from there. There were some concerns too about the Warner Boulevard, Bull Avenue intersection, just related to, moving traffic and being able to get through there safely. Areas outside of Boalsburg that people want to get to, Galbraith Gap and Tussey Mountain was our number one. Harvest Fields is kind of on the way. There's a lot of folks mentioning that. Generally, just getting to the township's parks. Tussey Pond Park, I think, was mentioned a few times. That goes together with Harvest Fields. Getting out to Shingletown and Mustard Gaps, again, out to our natural areas. And then finally, Linden Hall was another place that folks indicated they'd like to go via active transportation. And ultimately, again, if you can get all these areas connected from Boalsburg and you can get everyone connected into Boalsburg, it would kind of create the network that I think people are looking for. So the next steps for this is to have the subcommittee incorporate the remainder of these results onto the draft map. I actually have a draft map prepared. No, I didn't do it myself, much like the last map that we talked about, but I did guide the person that was doing it for me. And we'll be discussing the parking recommendations from the parking report at next month's meeting with the official map subcommittee. So they'll be looking at adding those to the official map as well. And then we'll be presenting that draft map to the Planning Commission, I assume the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee, here in the next several months. So I wanted to show you real quick the results of let me find the right screen here. Or some of these tools that we utilized for the public input. The reason I want to do that is I think it would be valuable for the Planning Commission to see some of these, because this is stuff we can use, tools we can use in the future whenever the Planning Commission is working on a project. Now this is the official map, story map that we put together. It's just a simple story map that we use to kind of give the background into what's going on, and then we had links out to these other tools. So the survey, I don't know if anyone took the survey, but if you did not, this is just a quick preview. Allows someone to to basically indicate where they live at. We're not tracking people back by their location, but it was helpful to try to know where these responses were coming from. And it asks just a series of questions like any survey would do, but it's something that we have free access to as part of our, well, I shouldn't say free, we're definitely paying for the software annually, but we have access, so we may as well use it, especially if there's a project where the planning commission or the board wants to get input. I think probably the other interesting piece of this was this input app. Now, I didn't pull up the app. This is the results page, but all of these lines and all these dots that are placed on here were placed by the public. So they were able to go on and, let's see, I'll zoom in here. And they were able to go on here and place a line and indicate what it is that they'd like to see. So a road connection from Kaywood to Linden Hall Road would be fantastic. And they could provide comments on what it is they want to see. This is just a nice tool to be able to allow people to provide comments of various types. They use dots as well. So folks could just make a comment with a dot if they didn't want to suggest a connection. Somebody really wants East K Street to be open as soon as possible. And they just provided that comment. So this, I think, was a pretty nice way of collecting input from the public. And what was nice is you can see, if you zoom in, there's a lot of overlap in here. And actually, we may have cleaned it up so you don't see it as well. But there's a lot of people that drew lines over top of one another. And you can kind of do almost a heat map approach to see where the majority of comments are being made. But this is something I want to make the Planning Commission aware of. It's a tool we can use in the future to collect input. So that was my presentation tonight. I just wanted to show everyone what the official map committee is up to and kind of where we stand in terms of bringing that back to the Planning Commission for your review and hopefully ultimately forwarding that onto the board for their consideration.
To your point about the survey and the mapping, it was really nimble for the user and easy to use, and as you say, can be a potential tool for future things. It helped us to get a lot of information that we otherwise would not have had. Any comments or questions? We still have some work to do, and we meet the second Monday of September?
First Monday of September. Oh, wait, we bumped it because of Labor Day, yep.
Okay.
12th, we meet on the 12th.
Okay. Thank you. Agenda for September.
So, something that's coming attraction. The Board of Supervisors wants us to look at our sign ordinance, which has been on your work plan for a while. They're going to discuss it at their meeting September 12th, and likely we'll have some kind of a discussion at your meeting based on what they tell us they're interested in looking at. One of the topics that's come up when they talk about the sign ordinance is the illumination of signs. So we'll probably likely be looking at that. I wanted to address one thing that's going on at CRPA right now. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. They've lost 2 planners recently, their Half Moon planner and their Patton Township planner, and then they lost a transportation planner, which I believe they're filling. That position's been filled. But Mark is the last land use planner standing right now in that office.
Yay.
So
You're collecting all this stuff,
Keep him.
right?
yes.
Let Mr. Mann know.
He's doing 3 jobs and still getting paid for 1. He's very lucky. So one of the things that we're doing, because we really don't want to overtax Mark, because Mark has a life outside of his job, and I try to be respectful of that, is we're going to put a lot of the long-range planning stuff that you guys were working on with the residential zoning and things that are not time sensitive, sort of on the back burner right now. Focus on some things that don't take up as much of his time now, so that he can focus on getting the other things done. Half Moon Township's got a pretty big plan he's been reviewing, and Patton's got some issues, so want to make sure has time to help our neighbors as well. So through the end of the year, we're hoping next year will be a little different, and they'll have be back up to full staff. And if you know anyone who wants to be a planner and has a planning degree, tell them to go work for the Center Region.
So sign ordinance, anything else come to mind when you think about things that would be manageable in September?
Maybe some of the parking stuff. I'll have to look at that. Some of the discussion stuff on the off-site shared parking and agreements and things, and looking at maybe the on-street parking space, just kind of looking at some of the theory behind that.
Okay.
And I appreciate that the official map is dovetailing with the parking component, because I think that that adds more eyes and brains to thinking about the issues.
Definitely. Okay.
Okay, moving on to reports. Center Region Planning Commission did not meet in July, nor did it meet in August.
That's an easy one then.
So we can move on to George and CCMPO, which also did not meet in the summer months, but he said we'll be meeting next in September. Mr. Igo.
Spring Creek Watershed Commission did meet, and we're moving forward with that commission. Last year, the commission got consensus to move forward and with a phase 3. And so we've formed a phase 3 working group, and I am the chair of that. So we're in the process of developing a work plan for the rest of this year, and we'll put together a work plan for 2023.
Okay. Thank you for stepping up to help lead that. And we heard about the official map group. Recent actions by the supervisors.
Supervisors have scheduled a public hearing for the on-lot building waiver request for the sewage management program, which we discussed before. Another long-range item that's going to come back to you guys, and this I think will end up being discussed at the joint meeting. The board had indicated a desire to discuss the landscape buffering requirements.
Yep, it's been around a lot.
And the Shade Tree Commission has actually started looking at that, and staff has started looking at that. The Shade Tree Commission certainly is not in charge of the buffer trees. That doesn't fall under their purview, but they have the expertise. So one of the conversation pieces we've been having internally is, do we use evergreens and get rid of the canopy and the understory trees and the shrubs? And do we look at using fencing as well? And the Shade Tree Commission has some thoughts about evergreens because they get the diseases. And we were thinking they could put together like a guidance document, like this is the spacing and this is, the kind of species and this is what they're good for. We also have, they've done a lot of work. We have a species list, so we're looking at getting specific species out of our ordinances and using our species list instead. So they're gonna be working on that in earnest this fall. And I think that you're gonna be seeing something again at that joint meeting to discuss, since they'll be there then.
And then probably, I would anticipate then something that we would actually need some work on at the planning commission level.
Yeah, it'd certainly come to you guys because it would go into an ordinance format
Okay,
to be adopted.
and then sign ordinance. Okay. Anything else? Business tonight? Anything on anyone's mind? Well, if you do a really fine look at the Roberts rules, if the chair says there's nothing else going on in the meeting, we don't have to go through the motion to adjourn. So, meeting's adjourned.